just starting your video.
Welcome, 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 everyone. So, thank you to all of our participants today for joining us. We are esteemed and privileged to have Crystal Tennille Irby joining us, who is a Grand Slam poetry champion, published writer, and doula, as well as Dr. Dominique Vadrine, who is a research practitioner, educator, researcher, therapist, and LMFT. Together, they come to us from Speaking Down Barriers, which is a group of individuals who are listeners, healers, artists, and researchers who work to, as the title says, speak down barriers through a lot of activity work, sessions given, trainings, what have you. We've had the privilege of working with them on many webinars, and as well as at our HIV Prevention and Education Summit. And respectively, they are the founders of Dream Healing Services, as well as Free Grow Movement.
That's
Um,
right.
so, so we are so happy to have them here today speaking to Anti-Blackness and Poverty, the dangerous impact of poverty on Black women's physical and mental health, an important topic that we're happy to put out there. So just a little housekeeping rules to everyone who is in attendance. You are all on mute. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A box at the end, in the bottom of your screen. And at the end, we are going to facilitate all those questions to our presenters. You will receive a survey just so you can let us know how we're doing, as well as a certificate of participation. So just keep your eyes out for that. And with that, without further ado, I would like to hand it over to you both to begin. So thank you.
Hi, everyone. Kyle did a great job introducing us, so I don't think that we need to reintroduce ourselves,
No.
as the infamous Sean Jay-Z Carter would say. Um, but I do just want us to take a moment right now and check in on how present we are. There is a lot going on in the world, and we can't come into this space and just ignore that, especially um, we're here to learn about anti-Blackness and poverty. Those are things that we often try to ignore and just grind it out and push through the day. But we do a disservice to ourselves when we don't acknowledge what's going on and how do and we don't have to acknowledge doesn't mean that we allow that to stop us. Acknowledge means we open ourselves up to ways in which we can be guided through what's going on that is of service to us, right? So one of the ways we could do that is we could just take a couple of deep breaths. So what I want everyone to do right now is, if you're comfortable, close your eyes. If not, just find a focus point. And I just want us to just breathe together so that we can present ourselves to this moment, open ourselves up to this moment, and be focused in on this moment and let go of anything that's going to block us from receiving what we need to receive in this moment. So, on the count of three, I want us to all breathe in together and then exhale. And I'll tell you when to exhale. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Inhale, exhale. Now, this time when you do it, I want you to through your mouth, fill up your belly and your diaphragm. Try to keep your shoulders down. And when you let that breath out, I want you to push it down into your body where you hear a sound. Okay? So on the count of three, here we go. 1, 2, 3. Inhale and exhale. One more time. This is our last time. And make it a good, deep inhale. Try to keep those shoulders down. Fill up your belly, then your chest, and just push that breath down into your body and let out a big sigh. Okay? Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Inhale. Now exhale. All right. Doesn't that feel good? Okay. You can chat in the chat box and say, yeah, that feels good. So we're going to go ahead and get started with some community agreement.
Yes, and what we like to do, this is something that we do at our community gatherings and trainings that we do with Speaking Down Barriers. It just helps us to have a sense of how to go about having these dialogues that we have. So we start off by saying, we agree to show up and choose to be present. And so while you're here with us, we're very, very thankful. But sometimes the content of the information or the dialogue that we're having can get a little bit difficult or challenging. And so people sometimes check out by getting on their phone or
Mhm.
going to the restroom. We really want you to stay with us during this
Mhm.
presentation and engage us in this dialogue. So when it gets uncomfortable or difficult, we really want you to still tune in.
Mhm.
We also, that when you share from your own experience. Who knows that better than you? So we really do appreciate people willing to share because that's how we learn and grow from one another as well. We also ask that you agree to listen with unconditional positive regard. And pretty much what that means is that you're going to hear stuff that you don't necessarily agree with. We don't come to reach at a consensus. Sometimes you're going to hear stuff that you don't understand. That doesn't mean that you don't respect it for what it is. So we do ask that you not be judgmental, but you can observe and you can ask questions. Um, and you may disagree with something that we say or another party says while we're having this dialogue. Um, but we try our best to be open so that we can learn from one another. We also ask that we try not to be right or perfect. Um, we don't claim to know everything, and so while we do this and we do a lot of research on it, we there's no way we can account for everything, and sometimes we may make a mistake, and we do our best to acknowledge that. And we just ask that, if you hear something that somebody else says that may be incorrect, we really want to have compassion and understand that it's not about necessarily being right or being perfect, but we do strive for excellence. And we do ask that we have that compassion afforded to ourselves as your facilitators for this dialogue today, but also to you guys who are out there with us, our internet cousins, as I like to call you guys.
Internet cousins,
Yes,
I like that.
we're from
I'm
the
gonna use
outside.
that. I'm gonna take that.
Okay. And of course, because we're not perfect, there's going to be stuff that we did not say here, but time permitting, we ask that you be brave and share it. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so we're going to get started with some working definitions. And these are definitions that we have gathered from different sources for the purposes of this webinar. These are words or terms that you may have heard before, and you may define them differently, but for the purpose of this webinar, so that we can all be on the same page when we say these definitions, we're just going to work within these parameters. That doesn't mean that our definition is perfect and right, or that yours is wrong. It's just that we want everybody communicating in the same language with the same understanding for the purpose of this webinar. So the first definition is systemic and institutional oppression, first coined by Kwame Ture, also known as Stokely Carmichael, and Charles Hamilton in Black Power, The Politics of Liberation, the book. The failure of an organization to provide an appropriate and professional service to people because of their color, culture, or ethnic origin. It can be seen or detected in processes, attitudes, behavior, which amount to discrimination through unwitting prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness, and racist stereotyping, which disadvantage minority ethnic people. I know that that's a lot, but use your breath. Whenever you feel yourself feeling tension, or feeling overwhelmed, just take a deep breath like we did in the beginning and just let it out. And you don't have to memorize this right now. Just have it on the peripheral as we work through the presentation. Intersectionality. Coined by legal scholar and founder of the African American Policy Forum, Kimberly Crenshaw, is when a person is impacted by multiple forces, social constructs such as race, gender, class, and sexuality simultaneously. So when we're talking about Black women, we're talking about a group of people who are impacted by systemic and institutional oppression because of their race, because of their gender, and their class and their sexuality. Sometimes that can be happening all at once. Sometimes it can be 2 or 3 out of the 4. White supremacy, a political, economic, and cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources, conscious and unconscious ideas of white supremacy and entitlement are widespread, and relations of white dominance and non-white subordination are daily reenacted across a broad array of institutions and social settings. So when we talk about white supremacy, we don't want you to think about people in hoods burning crosses in the front yard, in the front yards of Black people. We want you to think about, when you look at television, what ethnicity are the people overwhelmingly? When you look at commercials, when you see billboards, who are the people that you see overwhelmingly? When we think about the standard of beauty in this country, who sets the standard of beauty in this country? What do we think about as beautiful? That is white supremacy. It's not just people, I know we have this idea of pictures from the 60s of people just burning crosses in your front yard, but white supremacy is an ideology that places whiteness as the best, perfect, and what we're aiming for, okay? Black women, inclusive of all folks that do not claim male identity. This is inclusive of transgender and non-gender conforming people as well. And that's why we have the X instead of an A.
I'm going to breathe.
That is a lot of information.
Yes.
That is a lot of information.
Okay. So we're going to keep moving on with these working definitions. And once again, these are not definitions that everyone has to have, but for the purposes of this dialogue, this is what we're working with. And we really do believe to have a better understanding of the true impact of these constructs in our society, it's important for us to frame it and have an understanding of it from a historical lens. Specifically looking through the lens of colonialism, the dispossession of peoples across the lands, exploitation of labor, and the erasure of cultures. So whiteness. When we're talking about whiteness, according to Nell Irvin Painter, professor emerita at Princeton University and author of The History of White People, the constructions of whiteness have changed over time, shifting to accommodate the demands of social change. Whiteness is on a toggle switch between bland nothingness and racist hatred. So I know that's a lot for us to talk about, and we're going to delve in some more about what we mean by that. But when you think about whiteness, I want you to think about it along the line of a social construction that's been invented, that's lived, that's analyzed, that's modified, and can be changed. And through its relation with Africanism, whites have gained knowledge of themselves as the racial barometer by which other groups are often measured in our society. Poverty, the basic needs approach, which primarily measures poverty based on income proxy consumption rate, while occasionally adopting the multidimensional poverty indicators. And capitalism is often defined as an economic system based on free markets and limited government intervention. And when we talk about capitalism, it is an economic system, right? But it's not necessarily good or bad. Okay, now some people may disagree with what I'm saying, case in point, but hear me out. It is merely a system, right? A system of economic organization. It's a developed philosophy. What makes it bad or good is going to be determined by the people who shape it, who actually use it. So unfortunately, when we take a closer look at the history of this country and its foundation, the system of capitalism has been based on a history of theft and exploitation of indigenous people, Black people, Asian communities, who were brought into this country or who came to this country and were exploited. Their labor was exploited. So we do need to be aware of that. So once again, we need to look at a historical lens when we're talking about these definitions. And then anti-Blackness, according to the Council of Democratizing Education, anti-Blackness is a two-part formation that both voids Blackness of value while systematically marginalizing Black people and their issues.
And when it comes to these definitions, this is language. And one thing that we want you all to think about and process is why these definitions are even necessary. And if we think about Indigenous culture, if we look through a lens of history, ask yourselves, when did poverty become a definition? When did capitalism when did these things need to be defined, and why, and who these definitions serve and uplift, and who these definitions oppress? Okay? Just a thought, just something to process. We'd love your comments on that later.
Please hold on for a moment.
Okay. You're going to switch over to me?
I'm going to switch over to my
Google Doc. Okay, can you take your video down? Maybe can you share? Mm-mm. Communicate. No, because you're still sharing your page. So we're back to full screen. We're just having a look. We're not perfect.
Yeah.
We're not perfect.
I'm going to breathe.
Yeah, okay, so just let me see. So let's do this. Okay, here you go. Okay, so Dom is going to pull up the video for us. Go to escape. Just go to full screen. Full screen. Oh, okay. Full screen.
And in the meantime, while you both figure that out, I just want to say how much I appreciate the definitions that you all curated. You know, oftentimes I think as like white service providers, we look to definitions that are constructed by white supremacy. So I just wanted to reiterate how great those kind of starting with context and starting with definitions is helpful, you know, and just further, you know, kind of contextualizes and adds depth to the conversation we're having today. So I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you so much for that, Kyle. And we can thank Dom for that because I was like, come on, the people here know what we're talking about. They know what we're talking about. But Dom was like, no, we can't make any assumptions. And so thank you so much. Yeah.
You know, when, so we're right. To be honest, when white people Google stuff, sometimes they find the first definition that is best suited for their comfort level. So,
and thank you for bringing that up because we made a conscious effort to get definitions from people of color or marginalized folks.
Folks that are often marginalized.
Yeah, folks. Yes, thank you. Folks that are often marginalized. That was a conscious effort when we were looking for the definitions. Okay.
So this video that we're going to watch is of Dr. Joyce DeGrew, and she is a licensed clinical social worker. She does have her doctorate in social work. And this is one of our fundamental theoretical lens, which we use to help influence and guide this presentation. And so I'm just gonna go ahead and play it for you.
Hold on a second. Kyle, can you put me on mute and unmute Dom so that they can hear the video?
Thank you. Okay. Hold on.
So just a quick interjection. It doesn't seem as if the video is coming through.
Oh, it's not?
No, my apologies.
Hold on, let's try something else here. Do you think if we played it directly from YouTube, it would come through?
Possibly, yeah. If you share, if you share it.
Yeah.
And to all of our attendees, thank you. Zoom can be a fickle platform. So, and don't forget, if you have any questions during this presentation, just ask it in the Q&A box. And in fact, as you have been speaking, some folks have been direct messaging me saying, thank you for mentioning definitions from the perspectives of persons who are often marginalized. We have a really good exclamation point and yes, exclamation point. So while we pull that up, you know, folks have been really, really enjoying the session thus far. So.
Thank you for that, Kyle.
No problem at all.
Let's see if
Let's see if this works. Is that working?
I don't, we don't seem to hear anything.
Okay.
send it to him.
Well, let's, I can explain it.
No, let's send it to him.
Send him the link.
Yeah. And then he can share it. So Kyle, if we should share you the link, send the link to you, and would you be able to see if you could have it work that way?
Yes, let me, yeah, if you send it to me, I can share it out.
Okay, let's do that. Okay. Hold on for one moment, please.
So while Dom is sending that to him, I can talk to you a little bit about post-traumatic slave syndrome and Dr. Joy DeGruy. So this is actually a book that she wrote. And what she, I didn't copy it. So what she talks about is what she assumed was just part of our culture and how we operate is actually linked to how we learn to survive is actually linked to how Black people, Black women who were the descendants of enslaved people learned to survive under the brutal system of enslavement. And so those things were passed down because even though enslavement was over, I don't know if they can, oh yeah, they can. I don't know, even though enslavement was over, there was also Jim Crow and also the system that we live under today, where there are still parts of that and there's still a mindset that we feel protects us. It may not allow us, it may not, when I say us, I'm talking about Black people because I do identify as a Black woman. It may not allow us to feel fully free, but during enslavement, people had to make a choice, either survive or test how far you can go with your freedom, but you're also putting your life at risk. And so these strategies were designed to literally keep Black people alive. And those strategies were passed down without explanation sometimes. And because they were without explanation, because we didn't share those stories with generations to come, they weren't always understood until Black people got older in life and really began to see and understand the systems and institutions that we were working within. And so if you have any questions about what I'm saying, then I hope that makes sense. So one of the examples that Dr. DeGruy gives is you have a Black mom and you have a white mom at a PTA meeting in present day. And a white mom says, a Black mom says to the white mom, oh, you know, your son is doing so well, he's excelling. And the white mom begins to say, yes, he's really smart and he has an uncle who, you know, he's great at science and math, and he has an uncle who's an engineer and another uncle who's an astronaut. And then the white mom pauses and says, but your son is excelling as well. And the Black mom responds with, oh, but he's such a handful and he needs to work on this and he needs to work on that, right? And so the white son is listening to his mom affirm him, and the Black son is listening to his mom diminish his accomplishments. So the Black son wonders, like, why isn't she proud of me? Now, Dr. DeGruy says when she tells this story to a Black audience, they clearly and ask them, do you think this Black mom is proud of her son? The Black audience says, yes, of course she's proud of her son. But what happens is the mom isn't sharing with the son why she's talking to her son that way. And to be honest, she may not even know. It just may be a cultural habit. And so when we're serving particular communities and we see the way in which Black people or Black parents talk to their children, and it's judged in the media, unless it fits within the lines of discipline,
then we judge how that mother is treating her child. But what we don't understand is that during enslavement, if the plantation owner came and said, oh, your son is so strong and he's working so hard, he's great at what he does, the mother would say, oh, no, he's not. He's just so lazy, I can't get him to do anything, as a way to try and to prevent the plantation owner from selling him. She would talk down about him as a way to protect him, because she knew that if they think he's strong, if they think my daughter is strong and fertile and obedient, then she's of value to them. She has improved her capital to them. And so they're going to sell her because they can improve their status the better that the people they had enslaved are. And we can even look at Jim Crow. If your child got in trouble with the police, you know, you can find parents saying, listen, I got him, you know, I'm just trying to, you know, make sure that I can, you know, control him or control her and handle her. You know, you find yourself talking down about your children as a way to protect them from a system who may very well eat them alive. You can often hear Black parents say, well, I spank my children because if I don't spank them, then the police, if I don't do it now, the police will do it later. So they see it as a way of protection. And it's not necessarily right, but if we don't have the historical context, then we make judgments and we pathologize people without understanding that they are operating under post-traumatic slave syndrome. And so I hope that that's clear, and I hope that that makes sense to everyone. And often when Black people discipline their children, if we're doing it and the children are out of line and it's to get them back within the bounds of white supremacy, then Black parents and Black mothers in particular are applauded for that. I remember that there was, during the Ferguson protest, there was a teenage Black boy out protesting, and there's video of his mom running up to him and beating him and saying, what are you doing out here? I told you not to come out here. You can get arrested and you should be in school. And the media applauded her for that. And I was like, that's so interesting that the media applauded her for beating her son who was trying to protest against the death of a young Black man and systemic and institutional oppression. But had he been in her home and she spanked him or beat him for disobeying the rules of her home, she could have been criminalized for that, right?
Absolutely right.
Post-traumatic slave syndrome. Dom, do you want to talk a little bit about the difference between post-traumatic slave syndrome and PTSD?
So that also is a very touchy subject, because oftentimes people don't want to recognize that historical trauma in the way that how it impacts people today, because it happened so long ago. Mm-hmm. So they're like, well, it's not an event that happened to you. But when we talk about trauma, it's not necessarily an event. It could be something you've witnessed, right? And I think later on you'll talk a little bit more with regards to epigenetics and how it does impact us. I do know that there's a lot of talk or issue about, PTSD and how I've had students ask me, why is it racism considered, experience of racism considered, post-traumatic stress, disorder? Because sometimes you can literally continuously have a startle reflex, not able to sleep, you're very anxious, worried that your life is in danger. If you're in a society that continually, degrades you or belittles the people that you come from, and can be brutal at times with those individuals. So you witnessing that happen, right? When you witness that happen, the lynching, you see somebody get lynched, you didn't experience that, but that can be traumatic for you. We would say the same thing today. If you witness somebody getting roughed up as they're being arrested for we don't know what, you can look at that and say to yourself, that could have been me.
The difference is the legacy continues, and it's an ongoing, with post-traumatic stress disorder, it is often a one-time event, and the person is still not existing under those conditions on a daily basis. With post-traumatic slave syndrome, people are existing under those same conditions in some way, shape, or form under that system and institution, and experiencing those things daily. And the system that inflicted the pain is not offering a path to healing.
Yes, but I would say, I would challenge, because with PTSD, it depends. Because if you think about intimate partner violence, right. These individuals, are the person who's being the victim of the abuse is experiencing it on a regular basis, daily basis. So I would say individuals who are often marginalized, and in a society who continues to oppress those individuals or not be able to assist them the way that they need to be, can really experience PTSD. It's different the way it happens with when you think about post-traumatic slave syndrome. I think it's wonderful that Dr. DeGroot did this, because oftentimes we don't talk about this, we don't acknowledge it, and it continues to negatively impact us. And so we do experience that trauma, right?
So if you have any questions about that, please put them in the box. So we're going to move on to, well, let's bring this forward to how this impacts us on a daily basis. So if we we're talking about Black women in the United States, and there are things that, can you just stop sharing? No. Oh no, okay, just go to the next slide. Yeah. Okay. Oh wow, we have 72 participants. Hi y'all, thank you for joining us. Thanks for sticking around. Cousins, thank you. Okay. So the U.S. promises life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? That's what is promised. When we're thinking about the impact of systemic and institutional oppression on poverty, systematic and institutional oppression impacts the lives of Black women. It impacts the pursuit of happiness of Black women, and it impacts the liberty of Black women. And so I broke it down. This graph is sort of an evolution of a graph that was a diagram, that was done by Dr. Naeem Akbar, who is a professor at Florida State University and a well-renowned African-American psychologist. So I sort of elevated the original diagram that he had, or evolved the original diagram that he had. So when we talk about the impacts of systemic and institutional oppression, long-term, if you all don't know about so let me just breathe. So when we're talking about post-traumatic slave syndrome, we are talking about long-term generational impact and how that plays out over several generations in this country. And what often happens is that when we are serving people, we are looking at them now. We are not looking at them through a historical lens. So if we look at trauma and how trauma impacts people and families, their long-term impacts, not just to the person that it happened to, but also to generations that follow. So there have been studies done where people who went through a trauma, in particular the Holocaust survivors, their DNA wasn't changed because of the trauma, but it was impacted. It was marked. And this is called epigenetics. And what they also discovered was, even if these survivors did not talk to their children about their experience at all their children knew was, my parent is a Holocaust survivor, didn't know what happened to them, didn't know their story. All they knew was, this is my parents' story from the time I was born on, and before that, they were a Holocaust survivor. The children still experience high anxiety, and also had that marker on their DNA as well. So that trauma, even though it wasn't discussed, even though it wasn't centered, also impacted that child and how they functioned in the world, right? So if we think that about the Holocaust, think about the transatlantic slave trade and the history of enslavement in this country, right? So it didn't just impact the people who went through it. Post-slavery, you had Jim Crow after that. So that's another 100 years living under a racial apartheid. So all of those descendants, their DNA has been marked as well. And it's very important, not changed, but marked. And so how do we see these outcomes? Well, if we look at Black maternal health as an example, Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely, or Black birth persons are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from childbirth-related causes, not because they are Black, but because of racism. So not because of their race, but because of racism, because they are operating or living under systemic and institutional oppression that impacts them due to their race. It doesn't matter their socioeconomic status. It doesn't matter how much money they have. It doesn't matter how much education they have. Black birth persons are still 3 to 4 times more likely to die because of enslavement and being taught to survive by any means necessary, so much so that it's seen as cultural, that Black people are functioning with high levels of anxiety, but think that it's normal. So that has an impact on our DNA. That has an impact on us when we want to give birth. We are less likely to report intimate partner violence because we see how Black people are treated within the criminal justice system. And so that impacts our wellness. And so we are continuously operating in survival mode. And when you are operating in survival mode, you cannot pursue full life. You cannot pursue fully happiness. You cannot fully live in liberty because you can't fully express yourself physically, because it may cost you your life. If you are stopped by the police and you are a Black person and you question that officer, it could very well cost you your life. If you are Black people in an intimate partner relationship and you are experiencing violence, you may very well put your wellness at risk because you don't want someone else's life to be negatively impacted by the criminal justice system because you know that they'll be treated harshly, right? They'll be treated harsher than a white person. So the long-term impact of systemic and institutional oppression disrupts our ability to fully live as Americans. And systemic and institutional oppression produces a low wage and our free labor force by limiting access to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness based on race to maximize capitalism. So in order to maximize capitalism, you need a low wage or free labor force, right? How do you get that? You make a hierarchy based on race. That's how America got it. And individuals at the bottom of that hierarchy are in jobs that are least unionized, make less on the dollar, and are more vulnerable to negative health wellness outcomes. Who are the people at the bottom of that hierarchy? If we're looking at gender, it's women. If we're looking at race, it's Black people. That means Black women are at the bottom of that hierarchy. And that's the impact of systemic and institutional oppression on poverty. So if you have any questions, and if that was, or you need more clarity, please.
Or you need to breathe. Please be sure to take care of yourself.
Yes, please ask questions.
Now,
please
Crystal
ask
knows,
questions.
you know, that time.
Okay, let's go. Okay, so the connection, we can bring this present day. Atlanta mother arrested after abandoning special needs son. These are some headlines. 14 at a hospital, police say. So if we look at this headline, there are two things that I just talked about that we see. We see the criminalization of a mother, and we're getting our information not from the person who was involved in the situation. We're looking at her in one moment, not through a historical context, and we're getting the information from the criminal justice system, right? When this mother was in fact overwhelmed and felt like She did not have the resources available to her to take care of her children, and she was also facing home insecurity. If we look at California, the next headline, California Housing Crisis podcast, a closer look at the homeless moms protest in Oakland. So these were a group of women who occupied a house in Oakland because to protest the homelessness in Oakland. There are homeless people in Oakland, but there are enough properties to house those people. So they were in a house to do that. So these women took control of their situation. So they they chose to take control of the situation. So we have two different scenarios. We have one mother who is enduring her situation, and she's labeled as a strong Black woman because she's enduring her situation, even though she's been criminalized. She's just surviving her situation. The other group of Black women are taking control over their situation. So they're seen as powerful, free Black women. So they do struggle, but they choose their struggle and prepare themselves and create a strategy for struggle. So if we compare these two, it's two different scenarios, right? But both scenarios cost both these Black women something because of systemic and institutional oppression. Even though these women, the women who protested, chose how they were going to go through their struggle, they were still arrested. And even though this mother was surviving her struggle, she was still arrested.
Real quick, I'm so sorry to interrupt. It appears as if we are stuck on the 6th slide, impact of systemic and institutional oppression on poverty. So my apologies for interrupting.
Okay.
But this is tremendous, and we are getting a lot of wonderful feedback. So
Okay.
So can you tell us, Kyle, so what do you see right now on your screen?
the zoomed out number 6 slide. It looks like, Dominique, you are the one sharing out the slide.
Yes. So I'm still sharing and it's not moving. So.
Yeah, we're on our end, it looks like slide 7 is up.
Yeah,
it's not.
You're not seeing it on your end.
Gotcha.
Your screen sharing is paused, that's what it says.
Gotcha. And I've been researching on my back end how to address this, so my apologies from Cheetah for these
wait,
technical
that's us.
difficulties.
What about this? Hold on. Can you see the slide now?
It has disappeared.
Oh gosh. Okay,
and once again, I am so sorry for this.
Let's try again.
And to all of our audience members, Cheetah often comes into contact with technical difficulties, and we work our best to address it for our speakers first and foremost and our audience members. So thank you to Crystal and Dominique for bearing with us here. And
thank you to our, internet cousins for your patience.
What about now, Kyle?
This looks perfect.
Okay, great. Okay.
Thank you to you both.
So that's the screen that I was just talking about. So, okay.
So I want to talk to a little bit about ACEs. I'm sure many of you have heard of it, so I'm gonna go pretty quickly. The original ACE study was conducted at Kaiser Permanente by Dr. Vincent Folletti and Dr. Robert Anda. This happened in 1995 to 1997, and pretty much what was happened when we talk about ACEs is known as adverse childhood experiences, and it's a mix of experiences and exposures that a child experiences during their childhood that are considered to be potential risk factors for certain illnesses and a risk factor for influencing their quality of life and health outcomes as they become adults. And so adverse childhood experiences were looked along the lines of 3 categories primarily, looking at abuse, neglect, family, and household issues. And we want to go quickly over the findings from the ACEs study. It did have some benefits as well as its limitations. It was very beneficial in helping us understand that there's an impact that adverse childhood experiences have on a child's brain development and health outcomes for adults. It also helped us to understand that while there are these risk factors, it also helps us understand that it can be mitigated. The impact can be mitigated. It helped us to also see that once you're aware of a person's ACEs background from a clinical lens, you can help create and work with them on developing their treatment plan and treatment model that's going to help them to, once again, mitigate the impacts of the ACEs. We do know that your ACE score, the experiences that you have as a child, can influence the impact that your children have later on. So we see this all the time when children who have been sexually abused grow up to be adults. We see that these adult parents are more susceptible to having children who are also sexually abused. We see it with individuals who experience substance abuse in the home. Same thing happens. Or can happen. And we also know from the original ACE study that more work needed to be done. So some of the limitations that I want us to pay attention to is while we talk about these negative impacts, ACEs does not account for all the things that can happen in a person's life. And so it's important for us to be mindful. It does not capture the whole picture. The ACEs study was a retrospective way of collecting information. So the people they spoke to were people who were already adults, and they didn't really they may have accounted for their childhood experiences not as best as it could have been because it happened so long ago. There were some predictors that were not indicated or accounted for in the original ACE study. And then there's an underrepresentation of the population that was used. So the population was not as representative as they would have liked it to be or as it could have been. And once again, the original ACEs focused on pathology. And so those are some of the things that were limiting about the ACE study. But the Philadelphia ACE Task Force, specifically the Institute for Safe Families, created the Philadelphia ACE Task Force to create a study that looked at the impact of ACEs on urban communities' health outcomes. Specifically, they had two aims. Their aim was to examine the prevalence of ACEs in a more socially and racially diverse population than the one that was originally studied, and then to examine the impact of the broader adverse childhood experiences on health outcomes. So the Philadelphia ACE study had two subscales. So it included the original 10 indicators from the original ACE studies. So it looked at physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, emotional neglect, physical neglect, domestic violence, household substance use, incarcerated care provider, mother treated violently, and then mental illness in the home. But in addition to that, it expanded the questions that were asked to the participants and looked at, did these individuals witness violence? Did they live in an unsafe neighborhood? Did they experience racism? Did they live in foster care? And did they experience bullying? So it's vital that we take these other indicators because these too can influence one's health outcome and can potentially put them at risk. I'm going pretty fast here, so I do apologize. The ACE study population, what we saw when we do a comparison of the original ACE study by Folletti and Anda, and then the Philadelphia ACE study that was done by the Institute for Safe Families in Philadelphia, you can see there was a vast difference in the population that was studied. You see that 79% of the participants in the study, in the original study, was white, whereas 41% were white in the Philadelphia study. You see that college graduates, 43% of the ACE study, the original ACE study, were graduates, and while 13% of the Philadelphia ACE study were college graduates. And then you'll see that the percents of participants that were living below the federal poverty line was not measured or accounted for in the ACE study, in the original ACE study. However, Philadelphia ACE study did look at that. 25% of its population, of its participants, actually did fall below the federal poverty line. So what does this all mean? Why is this even important? So if you look here, what we see is that traditional ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, tend to be more prevalent in an urban setting, at least from when we do a comparison analysis of the results from the Philadelphia ACE study and the original ACE study. Now, when you look at these numbers, you can see there is a significant difference. Now, granted, we do take into account that there's also a significant difference in the amount of participants that were studied with the Philadelphia ACE study compared to the original ACE study. But nonetheless, it shows us the results are indicative of the need for more research to be done on ACEs that address the specific contextual issues of adversity of an urban community. Okay. So right now, I would like to ask if you wouldn't mind, if you have a Post-it or if you have a sheet of paper, I'd like you to write down the first image that comes to your mind when you hear the following words. Okay? Baby mama, low income, at-risk youth, hard to reach community. What images came to your mind when you heard those terms? If you would be so kind to type some of your answers in the chat room, I would be grateful. What images came to your mind specifically when you heard baby mama? Did an image, oh, you're gonna check? Oh, sorry. Okay, thanks. Yes, let's see.
So let's see what we have in here. Interesting.
Yeah. So from what I can tell so far, I'm going to ask this question, but it doesn't seem like any image similar to Rachel Green from the TV show Friends came to mind. Because I don't know if any of you know, but Rachel Green was with Ross Geller and they had a baby together, right? But we don't think about Rachel Green. They were married at one point, but when they had the baby, they were not married. They were married for like a day and got annulled, right? So in Friends, oh, wow, okay. I did watch Friends. But Rachel was never considered a baby mama.
Right.
But when we look at our conversation that we're having here, I'm noticing a lot of our participants, our cousins, our internet cousins, thought of a Black or brown girl. So I really do appreciate your honesty.
Someone did put the Kardashians.
Oh, okay, somebody did. But, okay, thank you. But overwhelmingly, yes. People don't think about the image that we see is, you know, a Black or brown woman. Okay, thank you. Okay, so why is that important? So what we want to do, it's really important for us to think about language, okay? Because language, we tend to have a tendency to stigmatize, shame, and blame those who are experiencing poverty through the language that we use when referring to members of a community, right? So we tend to think of, it's not uncommon for you to hear words like, someone's being too picky, you know, they're too picky, they're high poverty, they're low income. When we think about, when I say too picky, I'm being very specific. So if you think about somebody who may not, who may be experiencing poverty and they're looking for a job and there's a job that's opened, you'll hear people say, well, why don't they just take it? Why are you being so picky? As though living in poverty doesn't give us the right to be selective of the job opportunities, right? Or it doesn't give us the right to pay attention to our safety and where we live. So it's like we don't have a right to be selective, or people who are experiencing poverty don't have a right to be selective and to care about the same things that everyone else who's not living in poverty necessarily cares about. So that's important. It's really important for us to think about. So what you'll see in front of you right now is that these are some of the label languages that we tend to use all the time. We talk about at-risk youth, HIV-infected person, HIVers, AIDS patient, AIDS or HIV carrier, poor people, low-income people, hard-to-reach communities, marginalized people, handicapped or disabled. Instead of doing label language, it's really important that we move towards person-first language, right? So instead of saying at-risk youth, we would say youth in high-risk situations, because that speaks to and acknowledges there's a system that they're living in, okay?
Right.
Puts them at risk. Right. It's not that the person themselves is a risk.
Yes. Instead of saying slaves. If I say slaves, it's like a random group of people who were slaves, right? If I say enslaved, struggling of saying what to say or remembering how people want to be identified, are struggling to identify ourselves through language, that tension is our attempt to our attempt to heal and transform, right? So even if we mess up the language, even if we're struggling with the language,
And even if I'm unmuted.
okay, even if we're struggling with that language, even if there's tension in the lexicon of how people use it, it's really an attempt for oppressed people to heal. And so the way in which we identify people who can be experiencing marginalization and how we identify them is important to not only their liberation, but your approach, but it's important because then you're working to have a liberating approach to helping them.
Can you give us an example, Crystal?
So one example, and this is a really controversial example, Crystal.
But this is family.
So this is family.
Yes.
Is, and I'm gonna say the word.
And remember the community agreements that we agreed to. So we're going to stay present and we can breathe.
So an example of this is the evolution of how Black people have identified themselves, right? When Black people came to this country, they were not African, they were not Black, they were niggers, right? We went from nigger to Negro, color. Then we began to identify ourselves, right? We began to say, no, this is how I want to be identified, right? And that was colored. Then we went to Black, then we went to Afro-American, then we went to African-American, and then there was a controversy, right, of the word nigga, N-I-G-G-A. And some Black people would say that's an attempt for us to reclaim that word and to heal ourselves and to not give the final say of who we are to the people who invented that word. But there's also a tension there because that was often the last word that many Black people heard before they were lynched, right? So that tension is for the people who were victims of that word to wrestle with and reconcile. And reconciliation is not always clean, it's not always neat, but often when we hear people that we are serving use that word, we judge them. We have a negative look at who they are. We don't see them as people who are in the process of struggling with language and trying to heal themselves through language. We put judgment on them. If we can look at it from a perspective, through a historical lens, we can see that language evolves. There are words in our lexicon today. 2 years ago, I was going out into communities talking about sexual assault, and we were calling it domestic violence. Yeah. Now it's called intimate partner violence, right? There was rape culture was not in our lexicon 20 years ago. 20 years ago, we weren't seeing people running for political office using the word systemic and institutional oppression like it's in the lexicon today. So often when we're trying to evolve, we see that tension. Instead of judging the people that we serve, see them as wrestling. That doesn't mean that you can use the word. That means you don't judge the people who are victims of the word, who are using it.
And you know, I think it's really important to note not judging, but also not thinking you get a pass to say the word because you have an understanding. I don't use the word. You know, when you say it, I have a different experience, but also I'm not African American, right? And well, sort of, like I could say I identify, but specifically ethnically, I'm Haitian American. And I do feel like the Black diaspora doesn't always have a full understanding of the history behind that terminology as well. Because sometimes we identify, and when I say we, I'm talking about members of the Caribbean community as our ethnic background, like the geographic location. And it's also an issue in New York, like depending on where you're at. In New York City, you know, Puerto Ricans and Dominicans and, you know, Black people utilize that term sometimes. And it's like they have a free pass.
And I think what we need to do as providers, we look at, ask ourselves a deep question.
Crystal, lean in a little bit.
Oh, okay. I think what we need to do as providers is ask ourselves the deep question of when we feel that tension in language or see it, what is it that we are wrestling with, right? What is it that needs to be healed and reconciled?
In addition to that, if you're not a member of the Black diaspora, and you have the question of why can't I say it? My question is, what is that about? Why do I have to have the need to say or utilize, this word when I know the history of it?
So this is another impact of systemic and institutional oppression on poverty. Oftentimes, when people are in situations where they're trying to endure, it shuts down one part of their being and opens up another part and allows them to have this creativity. And they create this beautiful creative thing. One of the things is hip hop, right? And so when we create these beautiful things, right, that come out of these sort of difficult, challenging, and enduring situations, and not just poverty, but also experiencing race in this country, hip hop came out of there as well. Then everybody enjoys the fruit of that creativity, right? And when everybody's enjoying the fruit of that creativity, no one thinks, what did it cost the people who created this? They're just enjoying it. And so they take advantage of the language. And so what we have to ask ourselves as providers, when we see that creativity pop up from those situations, from cultures who have been systemically and institutional oppressed, we have to always be looking with a historical lens and saying, what did it cost? And if we're looking at what did it cost, then we don't necessarily have the question of why can't I say it? And we don't have the judgment of the creativity or the creativity that came out of the culture.
So we want to share with you some transformational tools that we think would be helpful in working with Black women, specifically Black women who are experiencing financial hardships, as we stated, are often negatively portrayed in our society through the use of our language. And so we do want to make sure that we utilize person-first language in ways that help to uplift and empower Black women.
And two of our transformational tools are a collaborative approach and shifting narrative. I am not interested in a savior, I want a partner. This is what Ayanna Presley said about why she endorsed Elizabeth Warren. Often when we come to this work, we are presenting these services, we are joining these organizations because we want to help. What we need to investigate is, do we have a savior complex, right? And if you have a savior complex, then you see yourself, you and you alone, or you and your organization are going to be the person that shift this person's life. Instead of saying this person, I am giving this person tools to do the shifting themselves. I am not the savior. I am a partner in helping this person shift their life, right? And so when we can come with a collaborative approach, and if we look at what we're doing as a collaborative approach and not a savior approach, then we can look at through a historical lens. We can look at that being through a historical lens, and we can shift the narrative of what we're supposed to do. An example is, if we shift the narrative of the organization that we're working for to, in 20 years, I don't want there to be a need for my organization. I don't want my organization to exist in 20 years, right? How would that change your mission? How would that change your purpose, right? Instead of saying, well, people need these services, we're providing the services, and going through the grind of just doing that.
And speaking to capitalism.
Right. So because when you're just going through the grind of giving these services and not thinking from a historical context, right? And not thinking from a collaborative context of, I'm giving this person the tools to shift their lives so that I can interrupt this, so that this generational pattern can be interrupted, right? So that in 20 years, this organization is no longer necessary. I'll give you an example. The free lunch program that the Black Panthers started, right? So now most schools in the country provide some sort of breakfast program to their kids. They weren't doing that prior to the Black Panthers. But the Black Panthers understood that breakfast is the most important part of a child's day, right? It helps them learn better. So they started this program. There's no longer a need for the Black Panthers to have that program. Now the government implements that program, right? So it can happen, and it has happened before, but we have to first shift the narratives within ourselves to taking a collaborative approach instead of a savior approach to serving people, right? You are a partner in this, not a savior of this. And then shifting the narrative of our organization. What would it do for us not to exist in 20 years? That's 2 generations. What will we have to do? You'd have to do some very radical things.
Yes, radical, and you also taking risk when you talk about being
Yeah.
radical. But in addition to that, when you talk about shifting the narrative, it's also about shifting the narrative of the people you're working with.
Mhm.
So when you hear, how do you view this individual? What's your sensing of how they got to the situation? Another transformational tool, often, in the work that I do within the clinical field, we talk about strength-based perspective, but we want to challenge us to think more about power-based perspective. So what's different? So when we're talking about strength-based perspective, usually we're concentrating on asking and answering the following question: what can we do to support these individuals to pursue and persist despite the inequity they're experiencing? Very different than asking, how can I work with them, to help them, Black women, to not only survive and exist, but to move toward experiencing joy, acknowledging their dreams and future hopes. That is essential. We're not here to make Black women stronger, or help them endure the impact of their oppressive systems that they're experiencing. Because that's what often happens.
That's cocky, though.
You're so special.
That's happy. That's happy. I didn't know she was gonna say that. She put that in without me knowing it. That's happy.
And due to time, we're gonna keep going. So we need to also be future oriented. Okay. And so what do you mean by being future oriented? I think about the Peruvian saying that says, your future is behind you and your past is in front of you. And so when we talk about our future is behind us, meaning your past you've already experienced it. So you have that information. Where you're at right now, you can utilize that information. What lessons have you learned from that, right? Oftentimes when we're helping individuals in this, who are experiencing being marginalized or experiencing poverty, we have a tendency to, help them focus on helping them to survive, but we don't always think about, okay, where would you like to be 5 years from now? In addition to where you want to be, tomorrow, where you want in 3 months, but long term, your future can be different, right? You can utilize the life lessons that you've had. When we talk about resilience, oftentimes we're looking at, she was able to bounce back. Well, we don't want you to bounce back, because when you bounce back, you're bouncing back to where you were prior to the actual adversity you experienced. That adversity experience is going to help at creativity on some level. And so it's the hope that you don't bounce back, but as Dr. Foreman Walsh would say, that you spring forward, right? So you take the experience that you've had, how you've struggled, and oftentimes, we do struggle, and it's about struggling well, right? So it's not that you don't get unscathed, it's not that you don't get hurt, it's not that you don't feel, right? But you utilize all that, you acknowledge all that, so that you can help you plan for your future.
And you're equipped with tools, right, to help you navigate and choose how you're going to navigate that struggle. And that's the problem now with Black women who are experiencing poverty, is that they have limited choices in how they can navigate that struggle.
Yes.
So if we have time for questions, Kyle?
Yes, there is a lot of excitement and a lot of inquisitiveness on the back end. So once again, thank you. I just want to say thank you for this presentation, and thank you for rolling with the not so perfect platform that Zoom is. And thank you to our audience for being so interactive, active, and supportive. So just wanted to lift everyone up in that instance. I'm going to go ahead and read some of these questions. These are pretty thoughtful and very engaging. So I'm just going to go ahead. So we have one question that says, I thought that Dr. DeGray stated that PTSS has become part of our DNA from the years of trauma suffered through generations. Is that correct?
Yes, but when she says a part, I just want to be clear that when she's talking about DNA, she's talking in a theoretical sense. You know, like when she says a part of our DNA, I think my interpretation is she's talking in how we move, how Black people move about their daily lives. But there hasn't been any study that I know of done on Black people who are the descendants of enslaved people. But I think it is also her theory that it does mark our DNA, because if it does it for other cultural traumas, then surely it does it for ours as well. So I just want to be clear that it doesn't change our DNA. Our DNA isn't changed, but it does make an impression on that DNA. And we have references for all of our information. And so there's a great video on NPR about this that I can send Kyle the link to share with our I can put it on our reference page that we're going to send to Kyle.
Great question.
Wonderful, wonderful. Next question is post-traumatic slave syndrome and internalized stigma. How do we as women address this?
That's a heavy question.
Well, that's a heavy question. Again, you can use some of our transformational tools. I want to talk about specifically one way that I think that Black women can, I'm really, really big on shifting narrative. Yeah. One thing that Black women can do, I think, is shift the narrative of how we identify our existence in this world. For example, I used to identify as a Black girl born and raised in South Carolina, the first state to secede from the Union. The Confederate flag hangs over our state, still hanging over our state at the time. My father abandoned me, just all of this. So I was defined by all of these other terms that people had come up with to define me. And also, I remember learning that I was at risk. I was an at-risk youth because we had to take this survey in when I was in 11th grade. And I told my mom, like, oh my God, I took this survey at school and it said I was at risk. I didn't even know I was at risk. Like, you know, and so what I had to do was shift that narrative, because as Audre Lorde says, if we don't define ourselves by ourselves, we will be eaten alive. And so now my new way of defining myself is I'm a powerful, creative, transformative being who was raised by a village of people who loved me. And so I think we as Black women have to begin to shift our narrative that's not defined by how white people see us or these terms that are buzz terms, right? And as people who serve Black women, again, I think you have to look at the language that you use. Who was that language created by, and who does it serve, and look at them through a historical lens and not a circumstance or a situation that brought you into their lives.
And I think there's a challenge with that too, because if you're thinking about nonprofit organizations that are looking for grant funders and stuff of that sort, they're looking for these labels, at-risk youth or something of the sort in your grants. So it is going to be, it's going to be taking that risk. It's going to be you choosing to be radical. But on an individual level, for me, I think it's very powerful and important, the language that we use. And we got to be careful of those buzzwords, because we talk about, and you may not like this, but bear with me, family, Black girl magic, right? Well, I think that's a positive term, but oftentimes it can negatively reinforce the idea that we're the magical Negro. Okay, and that, you know, I'm able to go through this and deal with it. But in actuality, it can be very debilitating for us. So you have to be aware and utilize the language, but you have to be aware of the potential impact it can have.
And the woman who started that, the reason that she uses the term magic is because she felt like the culture that we had created was beautiful and joyful and a sense of pride, given the circumstances that it was created under. Not that we had these magical powers, but that when you think of the word magic, you think of joy, pride, and this beautiful thing. Again, though, we live under systemic and institutional oppression, and when the white gaze comes on that word, it's not looked at through a historical lens. It's looked at through a lens of, how can this word serve me? Oh, that means you can do anything. That means I can put extra on your plate and pay you 70 cents to the dollar less because you're magical, right? So.
That's wonderful. I wrote, actually, as you were speaking, I wrote something about grant funding. Oftentimes, grant funding becomes this imposing, I think,
Mhm.
addition to the system where, the words that you use in granting, just further, I think, puts forth that, that negative, that thing that negates the trueness of an individual. So I want to thank you for speaking to grant funding, to speaking to, in that kind of mindset, savior complex versus allyship or
Mhm.
partner, or I like to use the word accomplice in
Yes,
dismantling the
absolutely,
nonprofit industrial
absolutely,
complex that creates
absolutely,
barriers,
absolutely.
So I just
And
wanted
often,
to,
and oftentimes when we work for nonprofits, we think that we're working outside of the capitalist system, right?
mhm,
But
It's a nonprofit
if
industrial.
it's a nonprofit industrial complex, and you can tell that a clue is always the language. A
mhm,
clue is always the language. If you're using the language and not interrogating the language, if you're not using a power-based perspective when you're writing these grants, again, you have to be radical.
Yeah.
Like, what if you said to we don't want to exist in 20 years? How much money can y'all give us not to exist in 20 years?
mhm.
Right? They would be like, oh, that's interesting. They would love those kind of goals. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. To say like we want to end us, we want to end our need
Yes.
as an
Imagine that.
organization.
That's radical.
Yeah.
I was a grant reviewer. If somebody put that in their narrative, I was like, they want what? You're not gonna keep applying for this grant every 2 years?
Yeah.
What? Okay. Let me see what you got.
Yeah.
Let me see what you got.
Yeah. It's yeah.
I also want to take a moment, Kyle, and really thank you and Philadelphia Fight for what you were doing to help be an accomplice in fighting systemic and institutional oppression in all its forms. And for you specifically, Kyle, I really do appreciate, because you are a white male. And in talking with you and the work that you do, I felt very comfortable not trying to have to make you feel comfortable while we have this conversation with our internet family members. So I want to thank you.
Absolutely. Because it's ultimately not about me, it's about your work and your information getting out there. So, thank you. I think it's about the dialogue. I think it's about, supporting the work that does address, the systems that place, harmful situations out there in the world. So,
And I also want to say, I'm not naive in thinking that every grant funder is going to respond to that in the same way. But again, we have to shift the narrative. We have to be radical. We have to remember why we started these nonprofits or why we wanted to work with them.
And that does include taking a risk.
Yeah.
Or several risks.
So it appears that we have a lot more questions.
Okay.
This is tremendous. We have one individual who wants elaboration on the effect racism has on pregnant Black bodies. What are the factors that lead to higher maternal mortality rate in the Black community?
Okay. Well, I'm going to allow you, Crystal, as the birth worker and doula to address that.
There's an organization called Black Mamas Matter Alliance, Black Mama Matters Alliance, and they have a website. I can put that in our reference page as well. Black Mama Matters Alliance, that can sort of give more fleshed out detail than I have time to today. But the bottom line is, the reason why is racism, not race. We are not experiencing this because we are just Black people. We are experiencing this because of systemic and institutional oppression. Because if you go to other countries where Black people live and exist and were born, this is not happening to them. So it's specific to systemic and institutional oppression in this country. The United States has abysmal maternal mortality rates in general, like for white women too. But it's 3 to 4 alarming rates. It's 3 to 4 times worse for Black women because of systemic and institutional oppression. And the reason I say that is because a white woman with an 8th grade an 8th grade education experiencing poverty has a higher chance of surviving her labor and her child thriving than a Black woman with a master's degree or a PhD living middle class with better health care. So,
I mean, and just think about the example when you think about Serena Williams,
right.
when she had her baby and she knew that she
Right,
had
this
this.
is going to go into,
Oh,
yeah.
sorry.
So one of the reasons for that is that doctors don't listen to Black women, number one. Serena Williams is a great example. The greatest athlete in the world, we can argue later, okay? Knows her body like no one else, right? And so she's telling them, it's a blood clot. I've had this before. This is what it is. They wouldn't listen to her, right? And I understand there's protocol and you have to run these tests, but what should have happened is someone should have said, okay, she's having a C-section. She's had blood clots before. She's gone through it before. So if she says this is what it is, this is how we're going to act. That should have happened before she even went into labor. That conversation should have happened before she went into labor. But doctors don't listen to Black women, and because also there's a theory that Black people can take more pain. Strong Black woman, right? Magical Negro, right? This was also an excuse for slavery, right? The thing that Black people are better athletes, like Black people can endure this and still create all this other stuff, as if it doesn't cost us anything. So how that shows up is we are existing under more anxiety, right, which impacts our pregnancies. And the other way is we're not listened to by doctors in the medical system that we have now. And historically, Black people have been experimented on. So the way that our bodies are viewed historically, whether implicit bias or explicit anti-Blackness, has an impact on the experience that we have in labor, which is why Black birth workers are so important, because you have someone advocating on your behalf while you're in the midst of labor, trying to advocate for yourself, and they don't listen to you when you're not in labor, you know? And that's why Black birth workers make a difference and are turning around those numbers. But Black Mama Matters Alliance.org, Black Mama Matters Alliance.org has some more in-depth information on those numbers. And Black Maternal Health Week is coming up April 11th through the 17th. Our podcast, shameless plug, Dem Black Mamas Podcast,
Yes.
DEM Black Mamas Podcast. I'll put the link on the reference page as well. And we're gonna be doing some things for Black Maternal Health Week.
Wonderful, wonderful. And just to reiterate, we are going to be sharing out resources and references after this webinar. So audience, please keep your eyes open for that. So another question we have is, what are some ways, and you spoke to this a little bit already, but what are some ways we can challenge language around poverty when this language is needed so often in grants to work with people who are living in marginalized communities?
And sometimes I think you're just going to have to take that risk. So instead of me saying, we know the term marginalized communities, right? I can go in there and just say communities that are experiencing marginalization. Simple like that, right? And I know we can't do that with everything, but we can start just initially trying to do that differently. We can start just utilizing the words in our everyday vernacular when we're talking with one another. And so we just start picking it up. And it's going to require taking that risk.
Or indict the system. So I run a program called Writers Well Youth Fellowship, and it's for Black girls in South Carolina, ages 14 to 19, interested in writing and performance, right? So when I wrote the grant, I didn't say, well, Black girls, you know, there's an educational gap and there's a wealth gap and all these negative things, right? Because we know that, right? But what I did say was, Black kids write more outside of the classroom than any other student population. So why isn't this translating into better test scores, more Black girls in MFA writing programs, more Black professors, and more Black books on the New York Times bestseller list, especially given Black women are the most educated people in this country and read more than anybody else in this country? That indicts a system. that says, yes, these things are happening to us, but they're happening to us because a system is choosing not to change. How much money can you give me to help that system change?
So in essence, what you did is you led with what they're strong in.
Right.
What they are powerful in doing.
What they're powerful in doing, but it's not showing up for some reason. That's indicting the system.
And then holding your founders accountable to helping to do the very thing that they're saying they want to do. So,
and I got $50,000 a year for 3 years from the Noble Foundation, which was founded by Warren Buffett's son and his daughter-in-law. So yeah, that's clappy. That's clappy. That's clappy.
Yes.
And I know it's hard, but I've been a grant reviewer and I've never written a grant that I didn't get.
I like the indictment. I like the indictment. I think that's really helpful for service providers, especially white service providers who need to step up and support and stand behind the language that other people who are not white are using, and not saying this isn't the right language. This is the language being used by folks who are living this. So,
and talk to some, get outside. The other thing is get outside of your silo. Talk to activists actually working in the community. Get outside of the nonprofit silo and go talk to activists, foot soldiers who are organizing, who are protesting in your community, and find out what languages they're using. You know, jump on some activist webinars. You know what I mean? Instead of just doing webinars, jump on some webinars that aren't going to give you CEU credit.
And you know what's interesting in talking about language? So from a researcher perspective, so the APA, American Psychological Association, has a manual that we have to use so that we can format our references and citations. And in there, this is the 7th edition. So I was reading it and it talks about having inclusive language around gender. So there was a time where in my PowerPoint presentation, I had put, I referred to they, them, and one of the participants was a grammar professor, English professor, something along the lines, and wrote that down on my evaluation that was an issue, that I should not have used that. I was trying to be inclusive, right? Now, according to the American Psychological Association, they know and they include that. So it's important for us to realize that that wasn't always there. This is the 7th edition. So where did they get that from? They're hearing it from people like us, right? So this is why I'm saying, go ahead, take the risk. It's not always going to be perfect. There are some challenges, but the more and more you keep doing it, people are going to realize this is what we need to do.
And the people that you are serving are taking risks that they don't even want to take.
Every day.
That they got to take. You know what I'm saying? So you got to be an ally. You got to be an ally.
So we are quickly running out of time, but we have so many questions, but we have one, it looks like one last good question from, we have an individual who is a Temple med student who emailed me their question. So multiple formats. So that I really, once again, audience, I really appreciate, like I said, your inquisitiveness and your desire to interact. So this is great. This is one of the most active audiences we've had. So tremendous stuff. So
it's our internet cousins. It's family, Kyle. Of course.
This individual says, I am a med student at Temple, which is located in North Philadelphia. So the Savior in North Philly is pretty ingratiated in the curriculum at this institution. They go on to say, I think saviorism is part of most med school curriculums today. Are there books, resources for being a better doctor beyond the Savior complex?
I don't know the name of it, but it's a book that talks about the medical history, and it looks at all the experiments that doctors have done specifically on people of color. And the reason why I referenced it, I got to get the name of the book and I can bring it to you. But the reason why I thought about that book is because it goes through a history of all these experimental procedures that were done. And these are things that were done to people for the benefit of our society, but these were done by physicians who took an oath to, help and heal the community. But when you understand the history of some of the things that have happened to these individuals, I feel like that's going to help people to be more sensitive and be more mindful in how they approach the clients or the patients that they eventually work with or the families that they're working with.
So one of my favorite books that I've ever read is The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. And if you are a medical student at Temple University, when I say Henrietta Lacks or helix cells, you know exactly what I'm talking about. They're trying to find a cure for the coronavirus. They can't do it without the cells of Henrietta Lacks. For those of you who don't know, Henrietta Lacks was a Black woman in the 1940s who had cervical cancer. She was being operated on, and they scraped her cervix and put her cells aside, and they came in the next day and they were reproducing themselves all over the room. Her cells are the first to do anything. They've gone up in space first to see if we could survive, and if there's a vaccine, HeLac cells were used to create the vaccine. Her family living today cannot even afford medical care. So that's a great place to start. Another book is The Half That's Never Been Told. And I'm only halfway through that, and I don't know if it talks about medical experience, but what you're going to have to do now is apply your knowledge, read about systemic and institutional oppression, and apply that knowledge, and then see how it shows up in the system, right? And I'm sure that there are some books, but we're just not privy to those. But I would start with The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, yes. The Half That's Never Been Told, and apply the knowledge. Because the thing about systemic and institutional oppression is that it's not necessarily a smart system of oppression, it's a very flexible system. Mm-hmm. So it can fit into anything. It's very adaptive, so it can fit into any institution that we're in. So the more you read about systemic and institutional oppression, the more you'll see it show up in the systems and institutions that you're a part of. You'll be able to recognize it and call it out quicker. But I would start with The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. There's a great deal of information in there about how we sign away our bodies and don't even realize that we're doing it. Well, and she's in fact not the only person whose cells have been able to do things, but other people have been able to negotiate, right? With that. So those are two books that I would start with.
Yeah, I mean, the only person that comes to mind is because we're in South Carolina, mm-hmm. but I'm sure we've heard of protests. Marion Sims, I believe he was the father of gynecology. Mm-hmm. So there are books about things that he's done while he has had statues erected and honoring him as the father of gynecology. But all his experiments were done on enslaved Black women.
Enslaved Black girls.
Oh, okay.
They were under a lot of them were under the age of 19 because that was seen as the most fertile time.
Without any pain medication,
right?
And that was intentional. So understanding the history and how that can impact what we're seeing today with the Black maternal rate, health rates right now, I think that would be very important if I were to be in med school.
His name is Marion Sims, Marion.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And there's actually a poetry book called Patient by Bettina Judd, and it's a book of poetry about being a Black person as a patient, and she talks about the three women who were experimented on. You could also read about the Hottentot Venus, Sarah Bartman, and how she was stolen from sub-Saharan Africa, and because of the shape of her body, Europeans had never seen it, and she was put in a circus to be touched, looked at naked, and if you paid a little bit more extra money, you could basically sexually assault her. And even after she died, they took her genitalia and put it in a museum in Paris and studied it. So you can look up Sarah Bartman, Hottentot Venus, and the shape of her body is what the bustle was designed after, because Europeans had never seen anyone's body shaped like that. So the bustle of dresses that you saw during a time in Europe, that's where it came from.
I was willing to share. It's called medical apartheid.
Yeah, medical apartheid. Yes.
A Washington.
Very apartheid.
And so what that does, it's medical apartheid, the dark history of medical experimentation on Black Americans from colonial times to present. was written by Harriet A. Washington. I would strongly suggest that that person read that.
And we can put that on our list as well.
Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. So it looks like we're just ever so slightly over time, but this is rich and dense with information and action items for us to go forth and do the work now.
Yeah.
So I just want to thank you both for coming on today and doing this. And I want to thank everyone for coming on remotely and participating. Like I said, I love an active audience, and you all have been wonderful, helpful, and your questions have been really great in furthering this conversation. So once again, Crystal, Dominique, thank you. To our
Thank
audience.
you. And thank you everyone who was able to stick around for the questions.
Yes,
Thank
and
you.
we so appreciate your comments. And we want you to know you can always reach out to your internet cousins in South Carolina at VirginiaHealingServices.org or Speaking Down Barriers. Just look us up on Google.
And you can find me on Instagram at Crystal Tennille Irby or at Them Black Mamas Podcast on Instagram. And from there, you can see the link to my website, the link to my podcast website, and other ways to follow us on social media.
Yeah.
And we'll put those links in our references as well.
Wonderful, wonderful. And with that, hopefully this isn't the last time we get to work together.
Sure.
But,
No, we're family, Kyle. You can't get rid of us.
Indeed, indeed. So, but until then, thank you. And to our audience, have a great day. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and go forth with love and compassion. So thank you, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.